Where's Florida at your place? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Paperwork. Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, you can, I always like, munch on it whenever, you know?
Oh, okay. You're going to be our speaker. Come on. Why not? I'm not going to be the speaker. Joe's looking for. Oh, you've read his book already. No, I haven't. You playing golf? Play more golf? I didn't play much golf with Charlie Palmer's back started off.
Talked with him the other day, he was gonna go to lunch, chatting with him about it, bowed out for today. Medical.
Can you tell if you have people online?
Yes, I can.
And I think.
Can you tell how many?
Yes. Right now, you have two, but they're still coming up.
How many are you up to?
Two.
Oh, yeah.
Too old.
I mean, I know it's good. Right.
I'm on the Thorndike. No, but it's not Thorndike.
So, Ed, I can wander around, yes?
Sean will track you. I'm the cameraman.
You work so loud. Yeah. It's good though, because I know it's some days, sometimes.
Yeah, you're here by yourself.
Yeah. If I have it open.
Just think what turnout I would have if I didn't have a home.
Yeah, right in here. Yeah, welcome, come back up.
Yeah, I can't think of your name, but I was trying to be included.
Hi.
Next door in the conference.
No, we're,
I'm not sure how.
I think, you know, I think
Do I need to speak in a mic or anything? or-
Nope, everything's set up.
well, aren't you nice to come?
Yeah, what's that?
Hello, Nancy.
How are you?
Yes.
Oh, yes, I know.
I know. I've been trying to get you to do it. Like your old email.
Oh, God, that's it.
Really, they're really entertaining.
How did you and Dory find out?
Yeah.
Call.
Yeah, and now they're very talented.
Yeah.
Very
Hey,
talented.
Dory, you're nice to come.
That's all the contact.
Good. I now have a proper email address.
Now you know where you get your search.
I need you. Yes, Jet told me.
David has a pair of hands like that.
You know, I meant to say Fred Walsh.
We rented space to them, and they
Reached out to
treated us
Greg, I recently sent it
out of
with
the
a
ring.
ring.
So you, they're like straight here and always like.
And then once you see them once, you get on the list, and you know they're gonna be good, and you're gonna be good.
Yeah, we just have to look like this, we gotta start. I think it's.
Sure.
I know, her legs, these legs, they're amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, sit on this side so the belly doesn't tip.
Where do I look?
Anywhere.
Anywhere?
Yeah.
Anywhere down there?
Give me a minute to start.
Okay.
Oh, you don't tip. Town crier is working.
We're running intro
I'm
credits.
waiting for the director.
Who's the director?
Go ahead.
Ah,
Good afternoon and welcome to the Jaffrey Civic Center. My name is David Beltate. I am the president of our Board of Trustees. Thank you all for coming today to listen to Joe's talk about his new book, Time for Everything. Only in the last few years have I gotten to know Joe. I've been on the board here for 3 or 4 years. Joe's wife, Virginia, has been on our board and a volunteer, and it is through her that I've gotten a chance to know Joe. Joe has been a great community member, a volunteer in town and all around, a friend to the Civic Center through the years. Recently, Joe has been involved in organizing our popular Stories to Share lecture series here at the Civic Center. Joe, as you know, has many stories of his own to share. For those of you who don't know Joe, Joe is a skilled attorney with 50 years of experience practicing law. He is a graduate of Brown University and Harvard Law. He is a regular contributor to the Keene Sentinel and Monadnock Ledger Transcript. We are very pleased to present to you Joseph Steinfield, a friend and a raconteur, to speak about his new book, Time for Everything, My Curious Life. I look forward to getting a copy and hope you all do as well. Joe, the floor is yours. Thank you.
David, thank you very much, and thank you for coming, and thanks to those of you who are online. Ed, we have some people online, and if any of you online would like to say something, ask a question, just go to the chat line, and Ed is going to raise his hand and tell me what the question or comment is. There is a time for everything, and a time for every activity under heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to love, and a time to hate. A time for war, and a time for peace. Ecclesiastes wrote those words, and the name of my book, Time for Everything, comes from the first line of that section of the book of Ecclesiastes. Very wise man, Mr. Ecclesiastes. Well, maybe Ms. Ecclesiastes, nobody is quite sure. So here's this book. And by the way, if anybody wants to buy a copy, Becca will be glad to accommodate you, but that's really not the purpose of this book talk. It's really just to get together, give me a chance to see friends, talk a little bit about this project of mine.
It's the second book. The first one, called Claremont Boy, came out 8 years ago. And on the cover of Claremont Boy is downtown Claremont in the late 40s, Pleasant Street, looking as it did when I was a boy. And just inside is a picture of my father and me when I was 13 years old. And you will see in the background there is a grandfather's clock. And for the sake of continuity, it's the same. Well, how I got into this, well, let me just mention a thing or two about this new book. In part, it's a continuation of the first book, meaning you don't really have to get either of them if you read them in Adnock Ledger or transcript, because over the last 16 years, I have been writing these monthly pieces. And when I wrote Claremont Boy, I took all the pieces and tried to organize them into some sort of rational chapter, subject matter, and so forth. Family, friends, sports, travel, and so on. So I kept writing these articles, and then I started writing pieces for the Keene Sentinel, dealing with the Constitution, the Supreme Court, and the rule of law. And I started doing that about 7 years ago. So the new book is a continuation of the old book in part, and with footnotes. Why footnotes? Well, I decided to update pieces so that there would be some added value for anybody who got the book and he or she had already read the pieces. But the second part are about articles or about the law under the heading Thinking About the Law. And all in all, we've got 137 footnotes in this book. They're in small but readable type, and some pictures. And I love the pictures. They are of wonderful people, one of whom some of you may have known, right near the front of the book. Actually, just went by one, can't see it very well, that's James Bowley, the founder of Monadnock Music, who died a few years ago, and the piece is called My Maestro and the Gift of Music. But here we have a picture of a friend of mine on Gilmore Pond named Bob Abernathy. And Bob Abernathy lived here and in Washington, lived here for a long time. I think Mary Abernathy is still in the house. And Bob and I became close friends. And at the end of this piece, I quote Bob. Bob was a man of the world and of Jaffrey. When our Gilmore Pond neighbor and lifelong Jaffrey resident Bill Royce died in 2016, Bob mourned the loss of a personal friend. He knew so much about this area, Bob told me. How will we ever replace him? I first ran across Bob Abernathy before he ran across me, because I used to watch him reporting from Moscow during the late 80s and early 90s on NBC. Well, the book has some rather favorable blurbs. I bent a few people's arms. My favorite one, well, I shouldn't have a favorite. One of my favorites is the last one, which is from Judy Rogers, the owner of Prime Roast in Keene. And it's interesting. These are excerpts. You can read more in the front, but the first one is from a former law partner of mine named Mike Dukakis. So he is at one end of this, Judy Rogers at the other, and I'm not sure the book lives up to the blurbs, but it's like a memoir. The personal pieces, not the law pieces. When I started writing about the law, I didn't understand really what the function of such a column could be. So I would write columns about the case of, Smith against Jones, decided by the Supreme Court, and here's what the case was about, and here's what the court decided. So the editor at the Sentinel said to me, why don't you get more of yourself into these pieces and, let people know what you think? Well, that was like unleashing a torrent. I've been expressing my opinions rather strongly in these pieces. The last one I wrote is entitled The Rule of Law is in Trouble. It's not in the book, because the book went to press several months ago. Getting a book published during the pandemic, it was printed in England, sent over by ship. The ship leaves Liverpool or whatever, and then, I'm told, they find a stowaway, and they go back. And so, no books. Finally, they leave again. I don't know if the stowaway read the book. That would be interesting. They get to New Jersey or Baltimore or someplace, and the books go into some container, nobody to unload the container. So the supply chain affects all of us, including my book. I got here eventually. And it's dedicated, well, before I get to that, it's broken down into categories: friends and heroes, first chapter. And the first story in the friends and heroes section, it's about a friend of mine, Tony the Tailor. And it tells the story of how I needed to get a suit in the early 70s, and I stumbled into this little shop, and I met Tony the Tailor, Antonio Natola, who, over the course of 30 years, more than provided me with any suit or jacket or slacks or raincoat that I had, that my sons had, and ultimately my grandson. And if I didn't come to Tony's shop for a while, I would get a call in my office, Giuseppe, it's Tony the Tailor, why you don't come see me? And that's exactly, Tony never mastered the language, but he was a master of friendship. And he belongs at the front of my book. I'm glad he's there. The next section, family. And the first piece in that section is called My Cousin from the Old Country and Bob Dylan. Now, my cousin from the old country was Martin Feldman. And this book is dedicated, in part, to the memory of my cousin from the old country, Martin Feldman, who died in 2020. He was our family's last remaining Holocaust survivor. And Martin Feldman, with his brother Stevie, his father Chaim, and his mother Lisa, were in the ghetto in Poland. And they made it into the forest, where they were able to hide in the Polish. We're not talking about the woods of New Hampshire, the dense forest in which, with the help of quite a few Poles, Jews were able to hide, and many of them to survive, including the Feldmans. The reason the piece is called My Cousin from the Old Country and Bob Dylan is that Martin Feldman, who was born in 1935, ultimately became an accountant in New York. And he went to work for an accountant named Marshall Gelfand. Now, I live a life of coincidences. Marshall Gelfand grew up in Claremont, and they formed the firm, then and now, known as Gelfand, Renner, and Feldman, and they were the accountants to every major entertainer in the music industry at least, including Bob Dylan. They opened an office after New York in Nashville. My cousin opened the office in London and then LA. And to this day, they are. I remember my cousin Marty told me one time why he decided to retire. He said, I don't know, I just don't like Michael Jackson's music. I want to get out, because he had become their club. But whenever Bob Dylan came to Boston, Marty would come with him. Interesting, the accountant for somebody like Bob Dylan shows up, and he is right at the cashier, watching everything that goes on. And I'm married, as you know, to a professional museum. You get paid right then and there. But Marty would take me to hear Bob Dylan, and we were close. Now, how did I get to know him? After the war, they made it from a displaced persons camp to this country. The four of them, Chaim, Lisa, Martin, and Stevie, came to Claremont because my grandmother, named Firestone, and Chaim were first cousins. Chaim had a sister who was in New York. She escaped before the war. How she escaped is quite interesting. My grandmother's uncle from Lowell, Mass, had come to this country around the turn of the century, and in 1938 he went back to Debrecen, Poland, to see his sisters and his bedraggled relatives who were living in this village. The word we use, Jews, shtetl, like a fiddler on the roof, a dust-ridden, poor, hungry village. He went with clothing, money. He wanted to help his family. He hadn't been there for 48 years. Debrecen, Poland. So, he was about to leave, and he said, if only there was something else I could do for you. And his sister said, take Rochel. In English, Rachel. So he was a 70-year-old widower. He was able to take his 18-year-old niece to America in 1938. Anybody here watch the PBS Holocaust series? Well, it's a timely subject. It's a great series. If you haven't seen it, it's worth seeing. How did he get her out? Anybody care to speculate how a 70-year-old widower gets an 18-year-old girl out of Poland in 1938?
Married her?
That's right, you married. And when she got to this country, the first question was, well, what will her name be? My mother and my grandmother went to New York. Rochel. That's Yiddish. Rachel. My mother knew a woman in Boston named Romaine. And she said, her name is Romaine. And she became my cousin Romaine, about whom I've written in my earlier book. So, Chaim and Lisa left Claremont, and Martin and Stevie, no English, bedraggled. They looked like refugees. They were refugees. Stayed in Claremont for a year, which they never forgot. And people in Claremont never forgot them. I went to my 50th high school reunion quite a while ago, and came up to me and said, "How are the refugees?" 1 year at Claremont. So why do I tell you all of this? I'll tell you what. You don't have to buy my book. This is a book called Into the Forest by Rebecca Franklin. A book, this is by a real writer, published by St. Martin's Press, brand new book. So I read a book review of this book. Now my book, dedicated to Martin Feldman, is out a few weeks. This book is out a few weeks. I think to myself, I'm going to get that book. And it will let me, it's about a family, the Rabinovitz family that lived in the woods in the Polish forest. So I'll read the book and I'll get a better sense, I think to myself, of what my relatives survived, how they survived, where they were, what it was like. I didn't read this hard copy. I got it on Audible, and I was listening to the book on my way to New York last Friday to see my grandmother. And it's all about the Rabinovitzes who had been in the ghetto and escaped into the forest. Early in the book, I thought I heard that Morris Rabinovitz had a friend in the ghetto named Steinfield in the book. So I wasn't sure, and you know, with an audio book, it just keeps going. You can't turn, maybe you can turn the page back, but I don't know how. A little later in the book, she talks about the villages where these people were rounded up and taken and placed in the ghetto. Not Warsaw, another place. And she mentioned 3 or 4 villages. Direction. Now, really, my grandmother grew up in Direction. So I go to New York, and on Sunday, I turn around and I'm driving north on Route 95 at the point where the Rabinovitzes escape and they go into the forest, where they meet up with the Feldman family. And the 2 families were together for 2.5 years. And there's a great deal in the book about the Feldmans. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. I bought it to find out what it must have been like, and I'm reading about what it was like. Even to the point where my cousin Klein's wife had to have surgery in the forest without anesthesia. A doctor was with the Polish partisans. Now, it's mostly about the Rabinovitzes, but the Feldmans are a big part of the book and a big part of the index at the back of the book. My cousin Martin, his picture is in this book. He was Monty, and Stevie was Samuel. And here he is at the age of 80, looking like one of the prophets or a Talmudic scholar or whatever. He and I were never out of touch. If you survived the Holocaust, at least in his case, where everybody got killed, except in my family, except for Romaine, she got out before. My grandparents came. My grandfather as well was from that part of it. It was Russia then, became Poland, now it would be Belarus. And they all got killed. And if you watch the Holocaust, the Ken Burns production, my cousin Chaim told me at Martin's son's bar mitzvah, he said, Joey, can you imagine, did you see the TV series The Holocaust? This goes back a ways. I said, yes, I did, cousin Chaim. He said, I want you to imagine something 1,000 times worse. He said it with his Yiddish accent, but spoke English very well. I said, I can't imagine anything 1,000 times worse. He said, that's okay, because you still wouldn't know how bad it was. Well, in this book, Into the Forest, you learn about the Rabinovitz family. So I look up Rebecca Frankel, let's see, Monday morning. And, she has a website. She's a prize-winning, best-selling author. And on the website, there's an email, and you can email whatever, her agency or literary agency. And I figured, oh, won't do any harm. So I send an email. It's one of these things where you have to fill in, from and subject and little from message. So I did it. Sent it off. Sure, I would never hear from anyone. 5 minutes later, Monday, she calls me. John, I've been looking for the Feldmans. I couldn't find them. Now, why she couldn't find them, I do not know yet. However, she and I talked for half an hour. We've had a number of emails back and forth. She has sent me something that I did not know existed. It is the memorial book of the Jews of Debrecen that was done after the war, translated into English, and it has a piece in it written by my cousin Romain. To think I didn't know about it. I have it. I printed it out. I'm sending it to my family. And Rebecca Frankel is coming up to Brookline to give a talk at the home of one of the Rabinovitz daughters, now a woman in her 80s, and grandchildren. And so I got an invitation. I'm going to get her up to the Cohen Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies if I can. I know the Cohens, so that ought to help, because my life has been fortunate that I've had such interesting friendships, relationships, cases, and some of them are in this book. Into the Forest, that's a great book. Do we have any questions from anybody yet? Nobody? How about here?
I just want to say this is fascinating. We were just watching the Ken Burns series, and I was hoping that the subject would come up, and you went right into it, and it's unbelievable. Your quote about imagine it being 1,000 times worse, and you're not even there.
Well, it's interesting. My grandparents had siblings. My grandfather Firestone, who died in 1970, with whom I was very close, was from a town called Bobrovich. I believe he was one of 9, 7 of whom were killed by the Nazis. My grandmother was, I think, also one of 8 or 9. She had a sister in this country. And I think the sister came early in the 20th century, as did my grandmother. Happens to have met my grandfather here, even though they both are from that part of the world, Belarus today. And they didn't want to talk about it. Now, I said, why did you leave? And I remember learning from my grandmother the word pogrom. Pogrom. And you will recall, well, Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, was the grandfather of all pogroms. But even early in the 20th century, my grandparents in their little towns would experience pogroms in which Russians would go around breaking the storefronts of Jewish merchants, and otherwise making it difficult to be Jewish, even though there were a lot of Jews. After Poland had the biggest Jewish population in the world at one time. And it became Poland after the First World War. So when they lived there, it was Russia. And they didn't want to talk about it. And I have subtitled this book, Time for Everything, My Curious Life. One of my regrets is not being curious enough, soon enough. Now, Daniel Mendelsohn is one of the featured commentators on the Ken Burns series. He's on a lot, and at the end, it's almost exclusively Mendelssohn. And Mendelssohn talks about his relatives and his great-uncle, his great-uncle's wife, and the 4 beautiful daughters. What he's talking about is all in his book, The Lost, a search for 6 out of 6 million by Daniel Mendelssohn. A great book. I read it years and years ago. He's a professor at Bard, and he's a syndicated columnist, a very smart man. The reason I didn't expect to hear back from Rebecca Frankel was that after I read The Lost, I sent an email to Mendelssohn. Never heard back. Well, when I meet Rebecca Frankel, I'm going to tell her that she's restored my faith. So Mendelssohn. There's a composer named Mendelssohn. Famous composer. I know a story about that Mendelssohn. I'm not going to tell it. Who else has a question? Steve? Oh?
No, it's totally fascinating. I love connections. I love serendipity. That's what you're saying. Serendipity, Joe. It's just beautiful things that come about from a spirit, a soul, which reminds me of Bob, who was a good friend of mine too. And Mary, we met in Moscow, right? And I run into her in the post office in Jaffrey quite frequently.
Well, there's a book called A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Tolls. That's also a better use of your time than my book. It's a great book. It's about a noble, a person born well in pre-Bolshevik Russia who then goes on trial. Anybody read the book? Goes on trial right after around 1919 or thereabouts, and he's got good connections, so he's not sent to Siberia. Instead, he's sent to the Hotel Metropole for the rest of his life. That's where he has to stay, can't go out. And so the whole book, or most of it, takes place inside the Hotel Metropole. Great book. Well, Bob Abernathy's studio in Moscow was in the Hotel Metropole. And my story about Tony the Tailor, there you go. I usually get back to the point. My friend Tony the Tailor, why did I go to see him to get a suit? I'll tell you why. It's in the story. I was going to Moscow in 1973. My first wife and I spent 15 days in the Soviet Union in October of 1973. She did not become a professional dancer, but she was trained as a dancer, and naturally we were going to go to Bolshoi Ballet. And we were brought there by a client of mine who was the Pan American Airways Russian headed up that office. In 1973, Aeroflot was was flying to New York, and Pan Am was flying to Moscow. Nixon was the president. It was the period of détente, so there were a lot of tourists. And so my client, after we had this case involving custody of his two children, the case was about whether they would live with their mother in the United States. They were then 11 and 7, or with their father and his second wife in Moscow. And after the case was over, he said, "We want you to come over." So I went to Tony the tailor, and I said, "Tony, I need a suit to wear to the Bolshoi ballet." So I bought a suit. First time I had it. Tony died in 2016. I went to see him. His daughter called me, went to the lady clinic, and I sat with him. And the last word he ever said to me was beige. Because I asked him, "Tony, what color was that suit that you sold me in 1973? Beige. And, you know, it's interesting, I've been back twice to Russia to teach. Once in St. Petersburg and once in an obscure republic called Adygea. And I loved it. And Virginia went with me, and she did music stuff. She gave a concert in a concert hall in St. Petersburg and got a review in the next day's paper. And she played Rachmaninoff, and she played Scriabin, and maybe Tchaikovsky, I don't remember, and the New Hampshire-born Amy Beach. And the review in the paper of this American pianist said, "Oh, the Amy Beach, it's never been played here, it's such great music." So she brought New Hampshire to St. Petersburg. Other questions and thoughts, Dave? Yes.
I kind of have a chicken and the egg kind of question. Your storytelling ability, do you feel that was innate in you, or you developed it from years of lawyering and you know, getting inside people's lives, and I'm sure some of your cases you're sitting at your desk saying, "God, you can't make this stuff up," you know? I mean,
My stories are true.
no, I know they are true.
You know, it's a nice question. I appreciate the question. Whenever people say, "Are you an attorney?" I always say, "No, not really. I'm a lawyer. I'm a trial lawyer." Or I say, "I'm a storyteller." Because what a trial lawyer does and gets paid to do is tell stories. That's what I do for a living. And how do I tell them? Well, I tell them with testimony, I tell them with exhibits, photographs, documents, whatever. But every case, and I've tried quite a few cases, you're telling a story to the judge or to the jury. And you do it the same way I assume mosaics are made, you know, a little piece at a time, and then ultimately see a picture. That's what I do. Sometimes I say, I ask stupid questions for a living. That's the alternative to I tell a story. I don't think I have a good answer, but I'll tell you how I learned how to write, which is connected to being able to tell a story. I learned to write because I had a great high school teacher at Stevens High School in Claremont, Mr. Paquette. Now, after I got out of high school, I went to, you know, Ivy League college, a fancy law school. I had a lot of very, very good teachers. But Mr. Paquette, to the extent that I can put a sentence, maybe even a paragraph together, he gets the credit. And the two really are connected. If you become a trial lawyer, you have to be able to get up and tell a story. After all, you get up in front of the jury at the beginning, then you start to tell them, here's the story of this case. Here's what you're going to hear about. And at the end of the case, you look at the jury and you say, you've heard the evidence. I told you in my opening what the story would be. Now you've heard it firsthand. Not because I said it, but because you heard the witnesses. You've seen the documents. And the story, just to hit a few of the high points, is as follows. And they are connected, David. The stories that I have written, do I have another 2 minutes, Becca? The first story I ever wrote for the Monadnock Ledger in 2006 is called My Lost Airplane and Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg was the man who worked for the Rand Corporation and then leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. Very controversial. I went to California to a conference of some sort, and Daniel Ellsberg was the main speaker. So he finishes speaking, and I go up to the podium and I said, Mr. Ellsberg, I'd like to introduce myself. Fine. And then I said, Dan, I have a story I'd like to tell you. Story time. Now he must have thought this is some certifiable crazy person, but he was polite. I said, actually, it's about my toy airplane. So he looks at me, and I tell the story of how I was given a toy airplane when I was 9. I took it down to Monadnock Park in Claremont. You were supposed to reel it out and be able to retrieve it. I reeled it out. It never came back. So I came home. I was very upset. And my mother said, well, you could write a letter to the toy company. So I wrote a letter to the Marx Toy Company. Louis Marx, the owner of the company, was Daniel Ellsberg's father. So as I started to tell him the story, and I said, and I wrote a letter to the Marx Toy Company. Now I've got it. I hooked him, and I told him the story. Mr. Marx personally wrote me a letter, I wish I had it, praising me on a well-written letter. This is even before Mr. Pocket, and saying that the instructions may not be clear enough. He's sending me a replacement airplane. So that felt pretty good. The plane didn't come. So at this point, Daniel Ellsberg said, we should have written him another letter, you should have written him another letter. And I said, Dan, that's what I wanted to do, and my mother wouldn't let me. God knows why. And I was a very compliant kid, so I did not write him a letter. And I never got the airplane. I'm on the plane on my way back to Boston, and I write this story, My Lost Airplane with Daniel Ellsberg. And Jane Eklund is then the editor of the Monadnock Ledger, as it then was. She had come to interview Virginia for some concert, and I said, you know, I wrote a little story. Would you be willing to read it? Next thing that you know, she publishes it. Dan Ellsberg sends me a book, his latest book, inscribed To Redeem the Reputation of the Marx and Ellsberg families. I have it here in Jaffrey. So I liked the idea, and I wrote a second piece. And the second piece is called My Cousin's Bar Mitzvah and Dominic DiMaggio. And I always like writing about sports. Oh yes, there's my cousin Romaine in Claremont Boy. She became an elegant New Yorker who lived on Central Park West and did charitable deeds. Married a guy who became very successful. But Dominic DiMaggio was the Red Sox center fielder when Ted Williams was the left fielder, and he retired in 1952, I believe. And I'm sure many of you remember him. In 1953, my cousin also directly related in the same way that I am to the Feldmans, was having his bar mitzvah in Boston. We drove down from Claremont, and after the ceremony, we went to the reception. Here he is, Dominic DiMaggio, known as the Little Professor.
Baseball card.
Yeah.
And after the religious part, there was a luncheon at the Copley Plaza Hotel. We were seated at a table, my mother and father, and my sister and me, and Dominic and Emily DiMaggio, who had retired and had gone into business with my cousin's uncle on his mother's side. I was related on his father's side. Dominic DiMaggio. So, you know, Ted Williams, I was in love with baseball by then, 13 or 14. So I finally got my courage up and I asked them a question. 1953, Dominic DiMaggio, anybody remember the question? The question was...
Is it related to Joe? Are you related to Joe?
Oh, of course he was his brother.
No.
No. Close. The question, now I'm 14, you gotta remember a 14-year-old boy.
Marilyn Monroe?
Have you met her? And Emily DiMaggio says to me, I have a good memory. Emily DiMaggio said to me, we're going to New York next week to meet her. 50 years later, by now I'm in my mid-60s, maybe 20 years ago, I go to a charitable event in Boston that my law firm was involved with, the DiMaggios and Bobby Dorr, of all people, second baseman, are featured. So we go to this event, people speak, and there's a reception afterwards. I walk into the room, and there are Dominic and Emily DiMaggio. She, by the way, was a very attractive woman, even then in her 80s, and I walk up to them, and I said, this is sort of like the Daniel Ellsberg story. I said, I'd like to reintroduce myself. So they looked at me, you know, another crazy person, and I said, I'm Joe Steinfield. Blank look. I met you at my cousin Jeff Epstein's bar mitzvah in 1953. And Dominic DiMaggio, I swear to God, looks at him and he says, Joe, you haven't changed a bit. I then said, do you remember the question I asked you? And Emily DiMaggio looks at me and says, no. What question? So I said, I asked you, have you met her? And Emily DiMaggio is this pause, and she looks at me, and she says, oh, Marilyn. That's my Dom DiMaggio story. So thank you all. I don't know that we have any chat line questions. It's very nice of you to come. We have refreshments here.
I'd just like to make a comment. We just got through looking at the Holocaust with Ken Burns. You have made it so emotionally connected and made it real. And it's really hard to not think about what Ken Burns has said in his program. And it just has put the personal touch onto it so much. And
appreciate your comments. And when I was in college, I was going to go and bum around with a friend of mine in Europe. So I said to my grandfather, who, by the way, he retired from his job of Metropolitan Life. He was the manager of the Claremont office. He was a member of the New Hampshire legislature when Lane Dwinell was the governor, mid-50s. So I went to see my grandfather. So this is in 1960, between my junior and senior year in college. And I said, Grandpa, wouldn't you like to go back to where you were raised, where you grew up? Bobrovich. My grandfather looked at me. He couldn't quite, he was an uneducated but smart man. He almost couldn't grasp the question, but he did. And he said to me, leave this country? Never! That's the immigrant experience.
Your closing words? Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Joe. I'd like to thank Ed Wachek and Sean Driscoll for putting the audio and visual together for us. I know it's a lot of work, and thank you all for a most fascinating discussion. And I wish you